Imagine a world where the very walls built to protect you serve only to seal your tomb, and where every breath you draw is heavy with the stench of 1,000 rotting secrets. In the heart of the medieval city, death was not a visitor. It was the most permanent of residents. In this exploration of urban antiquity, we will peel back the romanticized veil of knights and cathedrals to reveal the harrowing reality of the medieval metropolis. You will learn why the promise of freedom behind city gates often led to a gruesome end, as we examine the environmental, social, and structural failures that turned these centers of trade into efficient killing machines. It is a journey through shadows, where progress and extinction walked hand in hand. Following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, Europe saw a gradual but relentless resurgence of urban life between the 11th and 14th centuries. As trade routes reopened and the feudal system shifted, peasants flocked to cities in search of a better life, lured by the proverb that city air makes you free. However, these settlements were never designed for the masses they eventually housed. Enclosed by massive stone fortifications, the available space was finite, leading to vertical overcrowding, narrow streets, and a total lack of what we would today recognize as infrastructure. In the year 1200, cities like London and Paris were growing at a rate their primitive systems could not sustain, creating a perfect storm of biological and social volatility. The first and most immediate threat to any urban dweller was the ground beneath their feet. In the 13th and 14th centuries, there was no organized system for waste management. Streets were rarely paved, and when they were, it was with rough cobblestones that trapped organic matter in their crevices. Households would routinely empty their chamber pots directly into the center of the street, where a shallow gutter, known as a kennel, was supposed to carry the waste away. However, without a consistent flow of water, these gutters became stagnant pools of human and animal excrement. The sensory experience was overwhelming. The smell, often described as a thick physical weight, was a combination of rotting food, animal carcasses, and human waste. In London, during the mid-14th century, the sheer volume of waste from the city's butchers was so immense that it had to be hauled to the Fleet River, turning the water into a black bubbling sludge. This environment was a paradise for vermin. Rats and flies thrived in the filth, acting as silent couriers for pathogens that the inhabitants did not yet understand. Every step out of one's front door was a literal wade through a biohazard. While the streets were a nightmare, the water supply was a death sentence. Medieval cities relied on a combination of shallow wells, rainwater cisterns, and nearby rivers for their drinking water. Unfortunately, the same rivers used for hydration were also used as the primary disposal sites for industrial and biological waste. Tanners, who used caustic chemicals and fermented urine to process leather, were often located upstream. Their toxic runoff flowed directly into the areas where lower-class citizens gathered water for cooking and cleaning. In the year 1345, records in Paris indicated that the proximity of latrines to private wells was a constant source of dispute and illness. Seepage through the porous soil meant that human waste frequently contaminated the very water intended for consumption. This led to perpetual outbreaks of waterborne diseases like dysentery and cholera. Without the knowledge of germ theory, people believed that bad smells, or miasma, were the cause of sickness. Ironically, their attempts to mask the smell with herbs did nothing to purify the liquid they drank, turning every cup of water into a game of Russian roulette. The physical structure of the medieval city was a recipe for catastrophe. Because space inside the walls was at a premium, houses were built tall and narrow. To maximize floor space, upper stories often jettied out over the street, hanging several feet beyond the ground floor. In many neighborhoods, the houses on opposite sides of the street grew so close at the top that neighbors could reach out and shake hands. This architectural style blocked sunlight, keeping the streets in a perpetual, damp twilight and preventing the wind from clearing away the foul air. More dangerously, these buildings were constructed almost entirely of timber, wattle and daub, and straw. With open hearths for cooking and tallow candles for light, the risk of fire was constant and terrifying. When a fire started, the proximity of the buildings allowed the flames to leap from roof to roof with incredible speed. In the year 1212, a massive fire in London claimed the lives of an estimated 3,000 people as they were trapped on London Bridge. There were no fire departments, only leather buckets and fire hooks used to pull down burning buildings to create a firebreak. For the urban citizen, the city was a giant tinderbox waiting for a single spark. As the sun set, the medieval city transformed from a crowded market into a lawless wilderness. Most cities had no street lighting, leaving the narrow, winding alleys in absolute darkness, while many towns had a watch system, a group of armed citizens who patrolled at night. They were often underfunded, corrupt, or simply ineffective against the sheer volume of crime. The hue and cry was the primary method of law enforcement. If you were being robbed, you were expected to scream, and your neighbors were legally obligated to drop everything and chase the criminal. In practice, this rarely worked in the maze-like slums. Crime was rampant, fueled by extreme poverty and the anonymity of the crowd. In London during the early 14th century, homicide rates were estimated to be 10 to 20 times higher than those of modern metropolitan areas. Violence was a common tool for resolving disputes, and with no professional police force to investigate, many murders went unpunished. If you were a traveller or a lone resident navigating the city after curfew, the threat of a knife in the dark was as real and present as the threat of the plague. Beyond the physical threats lay a deep psychological pressure. The medieval city was a place of extreme sensory overload and constant proximity to death. The sounds of industry, the rhythmic hammering of blacksmiths, the screams of animals being slaughtered in the streets, and the constant tolling of church bells for the dead created an atmosphere of unrelenting tension. People lived in such close quarters that privacy was a non-existent luxury. In a single room, a family might sleep, eat, and work, often sharing the space with livestock or vermin. This constant friction between inhabitants frequently boiled over into civil unrest or localized riots. The mental toll of living in a death trap cannot be understated. With life expectancy in some cities hovering around 30 years of age, the inhabitants lived with a fatalistic worldview. They were surrounded by symbols of their own mortality, from the danse macabre painted on cemetery walls to the daily sight of funeral processions. This psychological weight defined the urban experience. The city was a place to seek fortune, but it was also a place where one expected to die young and unpleasantly. The most infamous architect of urban destruction was the Yersinia pestis bacterium, better known as the Black Death. When the plague arrived on European shores in the year 1347, it found the perfect laboratory in the continent's cities. The very density that made these hubs economically powerful now made them biological charnel houses. In a city like Florence or Venice, the plague could sweep through a tenement building in a matter of days, leaving not a single soul alive. The speed of transmission was horrifying. In the year 1348, the population of London was estimated at roughly 80,000 people. By the time the initial wave subsided, nearly half were dead. Because the city was walled, there was no easy escape for the poor. The wealthy fled to country estates, but the commoners were trapped with the dying. Massive plague pits were dug outside the city walls, where bodies were stacked in layers like cordwood. The psychological trauma of seeing one's entire community vanish in a single summer left scars on the European psyche that would last for centuries. While the plague was a sudden catastrophe, the air itself was a slow-acting poison. As wood became scarcer and more expensive, cities began to rely on sea coal for heating and industry. This was a low-quality, sulphurous coal that produced a thick, choking black smoke. In the year 1306, King Edward I was so horrified by the smog in London that he attempted to ban the burning of sea coal under penalty of death. The ban failed, and the air remained a toxic soup of soot and chemicals. Industrial processes added to the atmospheric hazard. Tanners used vats of fermented canine feces and urine to soften hides, while dyers used heavy metals and arsenic to colour fabrics. These fumes, trapped within the narrow streets and overhanging buildings mentioned earlier, caused chronic respiratory issues, skin diseases, and lead poisoning. To live in a medieval city was to be slowly marinated in the chemical byproducts of human progress. The miasma the citizens feared wasn't a supernatural force. It was the physical reality of an unregulated industrial revolution occurring in a space designed for the Middle Ages. A city is a parasite that cannot feed itself. It relies entirely on a constant flow of grain, meat, and vegetables from the surrounding countryside. This dependency made urban centres incredibly fragile. If a harvest failed due to the Little Ice Age, or if a war disrupted trade routes, the city was the first place to starve. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, the price of grain in some European cities rose by over 300%. Even more terrifying was the prospect of a military siege. When an invading army surrounded a city, the walls that kept the enemy out also kept the hunger in. During the siege of Calais in 1346, the inhabitants were eventually forced to eat horses, dogs, and eventually rats to survive. The lack of fresh produce meant that even if you survived the hunger, you would likely succumb to scurvy or other nutritional deficiencies. The city, once a symbol of security, became a cage where the inhabitants slowly withered away under the watchful eyes of their captors. If you fell ill or were injured in the medieval city, the cure was often as dangerous as the ailment. Medicine was a chaotic mix of religious superstition and primitive Greek theory. Hospitals, often run by the church, were not places of healing in the modern sense. They were places to provide hospitality to the soul before it departed. You would likely share a bed with 2 or 3 other patients, each suffering from a different, often contagious disease. The primary practitioners for the common person were barber surgeons. These men, who also cut hair and pulled teeth, performed amputations and bloodletting without any form of anesthesia or sterilization. In the year 1350, a simple infection from a scratch could lead to gangrene. The surgeon's solution was often a quick hack with a saw and the application of boiling oil to cauterize the stump. The mortality rate for such procedures was staggering. Without an understanding of infection, the surgeon's unwashed hands and blood-stained tools were the very instruments that spread death from one patient to the next. The medieval city was not just a biological trap, it was a social one. The rigid class structures and the stifling influence of the guilds meant that for most there was no upward mobility. Poverty was viewed by some as a moral failing or a divine test, and the undeserving poor were often treated with extreme cruelty. Public executions were a regular form of entertainment and social control. Beheadings, hangings, and the horrific breaking on the wheel were performed in the city square to remind the masses of the price of dissent. This atmosphere of public violence and social stratification created a high-tension environment. Riots were common, often sparked by a rise in the price of bread or a perceived insult to a local saint. In the year 1381, during the Peasants' Revolt, the City of London became a battlefield, as the frustrated underclass turned their rage against the symbols of authority. The city was a pressure cooker where the lack of space, the lack of food, and the lack of hope frequently exploded into bloody chaos. What the history of the medieval city reveals is the profound resilience and the profound desperation of the human spirit. We built these stone labyrinths to escape the uncertainty of the wild, only to create a new, more concentrated form of peril. These cities were death traps not by design, but by a tragic collision of ambition and ignorance. They were the crucibles in which our modern world was forged, through fire, filth, and the relentless endurance of those who called these dark alleys home. As we walk the paved, clean streets of the 21st century, we must remember that beneath our feet lie the bones of millions who traded their safety for the promise of a city, and who found only a narrow grave within the walls. The medieval city remains a haunting reminder that progress often demands a grim toll, and that the walls we build to protect us can just as easily become our shroud.